Please welcome to the stage President and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Kris Sarri.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back for day 2 of Capitol Hill Ocean Week. I'm Kris Sarri. I'm the President and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. As you know, Capitol Hill Ocean Week is a major part of what we do to connect people to their oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes. As we always say, this is a tremendous undertaking and we could never do it alone. So I'm so thankful to my staff and to our wonderful sponsors, especially our signature sponsors, NOAA and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and our presenting sponsors, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Curtis and Edith Munson Foundation. So just a little message, whether you're here in the auditorium or joining us virtually, we hope that you'll share your thoughts about the plenaries online via social media using hashtag CHOW 2022. Our first plenary this morning is Expanding Ocean Understanding, and we have a wonderful lineup of speakers. We're going to get started this morning with Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon. The Congresswoman serves as the co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus, a bipartisan group of House members committed to taking action to protect the health and future of our ocean. For the Congresswoman's work, we honored her a few years ago at the Ocean Awards Gala with a Leadership Award. I'm really pleased to introduce Congresswoman and invite her on stage to provide welcoming remarks.
Thank you so much, Kris, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici. Welcome to CHOW, See the Future. I represent Northwest Oregon, including the magnificent Oregon coast. As co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus, I'm thrilled to be here today to kick off this panel discussion. Oregonians and people across the country and around the globe benefit from a healthy ocean. Clean beaches and waterways are critical to the marine ecosystems and coastal industries that rely on them. The ocean regulates weather and climate, and its waves and wind generate renewable energy. The ocean nourishes us, it allows us to travel, and it offers tremendous recreational and economic opportunities. But today, our ocean and coastlines are threatened more than ever. The ocean has absorbed a significant amount of the heat from human-caused global warming and almost 1/3 of all carbon dioxide emissions. Every day, the ocean bears the brunt of our actions. As the ocean continues absorbing heat, sea temperatures and climate patterns will change and sea levels will rise. A recent interagency report led by NOAA found that U.S. coastlines will experience an additional 10 to 12 inches of sea level rise by 2050. This change will be devastating for coastal communities, including many of the communities in the district I'm honored to represent. Additional sea level rise will increase the frequency of severe flooding, overwhelm stormwater and wastewater infrastructure, and stress coastal wetlands and estuaries. An important way we can address the climate change ocean nexus is through improving our understanding of the ocean. Currently, more than 80% of the ocean remains unexplored. During the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, we have the opportunity to significantly expand our understanding of the global ocean to achieve more effective climate solutions and outcomes. This exploration deficit is one of the reasons why I've reintroduced my Blue Globe Act. This bipartisan legislation will assess the potential for an advanced research project agency oceans, or ARPA-O, which would advance and deploy emerging data and monitoring technologies through cooperative institutes. The bill would improve federal investments in ocean data and monitoring, create an Ocean Innovation Prize to catalyze the rapid development and deployment of data collection and monitoring technology, and also would support education and workforce development efforts for the blue economy. We must also rethink how we capture and leverage knowledge and information. Late last year, I participated in a hearing in the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, on which I'm honored to serve. The hearing was about Indigenous ecological knowledge. We discussed how Indigenous peoples not only disproportionately experience the effects of climate change, but how they are also key to addressing the climate crisis. Through traditional knowledge and scientific inquiry, tribes are helping to build resilience and adaptation efforts. Later this morning, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield from Oregon State University. a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, who specializes in traditional ecological knowledge. I know you will enjoy her presentation. Oregon State University has also given us Dr. Spinrad, of course, our current NOAA administrator. Earlier, I mentioned that I'm co-chair.
Or stories, genealogies passed down from generation to generation. Pele, the goddess of fire, and her sister, Namaka o Kahele, the goddess of the ocean, who were born in Tahiti and were bitter rivals at times, fought their way from Tahiti all the way to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. And as Namaka o Kahele took the shape of a shark and Pele was the goddess of fire, they fought their way from the Northwest Hawaiian Islands all the way down to the Hawaiian Island chain. And as a result, in Hawaiian ancient mythology, that is how the Northwest Hawaiian Islands were born. As we look forward to the future, I would like to emphasize the importance of continued conservation. As a Native Hawaiian, for myself being only the second Native Hawaiian to walk the halls of Congress since statehood to represent Hawaii, my family comes from one of the last remaining fishing villages in Hawaii. And for all of you that ever get an opportunity to come to Hawaii, I would encourage you to come to Moku o Keawe, or the island of Hawaii, the largest island in the Hawaiian Islands. And there's a small fishing village named Miloli'i, unofficially known as the last fishing village in Hawaii. My name literally means ocean. For all of you, today you're learning a Hawaiian word. Kai means ocean. And my full name, Kaialiʻi, means chief of the ocean. Ali'i means chief in Hawaiian. That was a name given to me by my grandmother. So coming from Miloli'i, I deeply understand the importance of protecting our oceans and coasts to fulfill our kuleana, or our responsibility as stewards of the environment. The ancient Native Hawaiians were the astronauts of our ancestors. They were the greatest navigators in the history of the world. And they continuously traversed 2,500 miles of deep sea ocean from Tahiti to the Hawaiian Islands. Through those migrations, they reawakened cultural pride and identity and this intimate connection of an island community to our oceans. Hawaiians mastered the way to live sustainably. And prior to 1778, or the arrival of Captain Cook in the Hawaiian Islands, Native Hawaiians that had numbered somewhere between 400,000 to 1.2 million people lived 100% sustainable in the Hawaiian Islands. And they survived on the oceans, and they survived on their land and their aina. Native Hawaiians found a way to blend traditional and both modern technologies, and that has helped us find our way to a healthier future. Native Hawaiians also understand how to coexist with the environment. And we have consistently, in the Congress and in the state of Hawaii, supported programs that use Indigenous knowledge to protect our oceans. I firmly believe, as a Native Hawaiian, that Indigenous wisdom is the solution to inspire contemporary solutions for our modern world. And it is why we have consistently worked to ensure that projects in Hawaii support funding our coastlines and our oceans. We also work closely with Native Hawaiian organizations who are eligible for programs within the Water Resources and Development Act so that we can use their understanding and their knowledge to support the reinvestment in our coastal communities. I firmly believe that it is our duty to preserve the national treasures and resources of our nation for our children, our keiki, and future generations to come. Climate change poses a renewed and daunting challenge for our planet. We know that through science that there is a direct correlation to burning fossil fuels, which increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and are then absorbed into our oceans. The result is rising sea level temperatures, which impact our coral reefs. Our ecosystems that thrive and survive in our oceans and in Hawaii are critical and vital nearshore fisheries. It is why Hawaii has set a bold goal of achieving 100% electricity generation from renewable energy sources by 2045. Because we know that if we do not do this, as islands in the sea, impacts to our shared future because of climate change will be pronounced. And so I mahalo all of you for convening and having this conference. This conversation that hosts this dialogue around our oceans will encourage innovative solutions that can give all of us, and it gives myself the confidence in our ability to combat this issue as a nation. I look forward to celebrating all that our nation has accomplished in the past 50 years this week, and I'm excited to uphold this legacy and continue to protect our oceans, coasts, and lakes for years to come. I really believe, in closing, that if we can collectively do anything to impact the future of our oceans, it is by having this conversation, by gathering here in person or virtually online, by starting this movement, which began 50 years ago, by being a part of this movement so that we can all integrate a new mindset and hopefully make meaningful changes so that we no longer have to have this discussion 50 years from now, because our children and future generations of elected leaders will get it. They will know it, and it will be the new normal. It won't be one or the other. What we are doing today will impact the leaders of tomorrow and the future generations of this great nation. So I wish you all in having a great conference. Mahalo nui loa for having me. Have a great day, and aloha.
Mahalo, Congressman. To get our session started, I want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Alan Leonardi, who is President and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. Alan is an experienced leader in ocean science, research management, and the education community, and a very good friend and supporter of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. Alan, I welcome you to the stage with your guest. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As Kris said, I am Alan Leonardi. I'm the president and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. And I'm here today to moderate the session with my esteemed panel, Carly, Tiara, Lee, and online, Larry and Samantha. We're not going to go through introductions of each speaker as we talked here today. Their bios are online. I encourage you to read them. But as the panelist jumps in to answer a question for the first time, they will briefly introduce themselves and where they come from. So in order to get on with the discussion, why don't we just jump right into it? The topic of our session here today is on how indigenous knowledge and wisdom, science by public citizens, and new technology can expand our understanding of the ocean in the face of climate change. All of you participating in this discussion are expert in one or more of these areas of this session. So let me start with this question first. In your opinion, what do you see as the relationship between traditional and local knowledge, wisdom, and Western science? Don't be shy.
I'll jump in, I'll start. My name is Carly Weiner. I'm the Director of Communications at Schmidt Ocean Institute. It's a great question. It's a pretty broad question. And I would start the conversation off by just saying that we often categorize things into these boxes, and it's not an either-or situation. So it's not a matter of Western science with community science and Indigenous science. It's about bringing them together, but also honoring the separate knowledge systems and how they can complete the picture for us.
Thank you. Others want to jump in on this one?
Sure. Unless you want to.
Yeah, okay, let's do it. I'm Dr. Tiara Moore. I'm the founder and CEO of Black and Marine Science. I'm also the BIMS program lead at the Nature Conservancy. So yeah, thanks for the question. So when I think about Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and Western science and the overlap, I think the overlap comes because Indigenous science and wisdom was kind of co-opted into Western science, and that's what we call that today. So I think the overlap really comes is that we have a field that we have now that is really utilizing that wisdom of the past, but doesn't necessarily always acknowledge that. And so I'm glad that we are having these conversations now because we need to call this out. What are we doing to really uplift, our ancestors in that knowledge, and how are we using that in our research today, and how are we going to finally start citing it and stop stealing? So, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm Leah Shanley. I'm the director of the International Computer Science Institute and one of the co-founders of the Federal Community of Practice on Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science that built citizenscience.gov. I think NOAA has had a long history of engaging local knowledge and volunteers in the observation process for weather, oceans, and coasts. Community science, for example, can increase the spatial and temporal resolution of the data that we collect, can extend the geographic extent of the data collect and the context of the land or the ocean that we're working on. That said, I would say community science augments and enhances Western science. It's another methodology in our toolbox for science.
Thanks. And I want to make sure we're being mindful of those online. So Samantha or Larry, if either of you want to jump in. And I'll also note that those online, please feel free to issue questions if you have questions from the audience as well. They'll get them up to here and we'll weave them into the conversation. So Larry, please, I think you want to talk.
Yeah, this is Larry, and I'm hearing a terrible echo, so it's difficult for me to speak. Are you hearing the echo too, Alan?
We do not hear the echo. We just hear you.
Are you hearing me at all? Alan?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll just keep going and try to live through the echo. It's actually gone now. That's great. And I'm going to leave Samantha with the last word, but she's certainly closest to this. But I think the congressman kind of summed it up nicely. To introduce myself, I'm the director of the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping at the University of New Hampshire. But on this panel, I'm really representing the U.S. National Committee for the Decade of Ocean Science in Support of Sustainable Development, a committee which I chair. And as we think about this focus we have now on sustainable development, as the congressman pointed out, many of the indigenous communities have for generations lived sustainably. And so I think that there are obviously tremendous lessons to be learned, but I think it's also important that we use that as a starting place, that we basically take a step back and don't start saying, here's a science plan. Let's go and view how these peoples have lived indigenous sustainably for so long and try to listen and understand and then turn around and see what the science behind that was. And so it's really, to me, an order of events that we start by listening and watching, and then seeing what the science behind that was. And I think it'll be a tremendous addition to the approach that we take as we strive for globally sustainable development.
Chela, Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield. I'm from Oregon State. I think that it's really important to point out that there are many ecological knowledges. I'm getting an echo as well. Turn myself down a little bit. There are different ecological knowledges like farmers' ecological knowledge and fishers' ecological knowledge. And it isn't just traditional ecological knowledge. That's a misnomer that, all of the information is being attributed to traditional ecological knowledge, but that grouping of disciplines is very specific for Indigenous peoples. And there are different TEKs for each tribal or Indigenous group, and that happens worldwide. It isn't just here in the United States or, in islands. It's very distinct for each Indigenous group worldwide. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that we can look worldwide for all of this and, bring it home and really work collectively on these issues that are worldwide.
Great. Thank you all for that introduction of yourselves and the questions being answered. I think where I want to go after this is, after I think about your responses, is to think about what about the intersection of technology with the knowledge and the wisdom, whether it's local and community knowledge or whether it's Western science. Where is that intersection point, and how important do you think that is?
Okay, I'll jump in. So for community-based science, it's amazing. Everyone has a smartphone these days, and you can take pictures, you can put low-cost sensors, attachments, electronic logs, software-supported decision support on the mobile phones that really help Americans, Indigenous peoples contribute data. The LEO network, for example, in Alaska is using these technologies. There's a need for development of low-cost sensors that would, for broader usage by community science. And so there's a great example in NOAA where they, the Sargassum information system for the Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico is combining satellite-based Sargassum inundation bulletins and then using community-based science to validate that data. So EpiCollect Sargassum Watch project, everybody's got a cell phone, they take pictures of the Sargassum rafts, the width, dimension, the time and date, and so even if property owners remove that Sargassum, they still have a record of it. And so that's NOAA Coast Watch, NOAA AOML, and the University of South Florida.
Others want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think about technology in two ways. So for my research as a scientist, I use environmental DNA or eDNA to conduct community biodiversity assessments to really understand what's going on in the ecosystem. And so I kind of explain eDNA. If you watch crime shows, you know, there's a criminal does something, they'll leave a fingerprint. And so that's what's happening in the environment as we're moving around, animals are moving about, they're shedding skin, pollen, feces, all of that has genetic information that we can now scoop up in a vial, water sample, sediment sample, air sample, take it to the lab, do a bunch of work, and then we could tell the organisms that are in the ecosystem. And so that's really replacing like traditional biomonitoring where you're out, you know, doing surveys or doing counts. And so this technology is really cool when you think about community science because it's something that you can really engage large amounts of people. So I can go out and say, hey, I can take a whole team with me to just collect some dirt or collect some water, and then also provide them with instructions in the lab. So that's a really cool method that we can use to really engage other folks. But of course, I also have to talk about social media in science communication, because I think that's a huge technology that we can use to really advance our field. You know, we talk about our hard science and we love the white papers, but if folks that look like me and my grandma, if I can't talk to her, she's not reading my white paper. She's like, no, but what she is on TikTok, looking at little videos, and she'll show them to me. I'm like, what, grandma? Like, what's this? But how can we use that and have the understanding of that and talk about our science in a way that's easily accessible to folks, because we want everyone to understand what's going on because it's so important. So, yeah.
I think I'd like to add to that too, in that you're absolutely right with social media and just the democratization of information and making that available from an exploration perspective, being able to have telepresence and share deep sea environments and areas that we weren't able to look at before with the world, and to engage people in a way where they can be making joint observations and discussions around the science that's taking place, and not only collecting that information, but we now have artificial intelligence and machine learning that allows us to process that large amounts of information that we're collecting. It's a really hopeful time in science.
All right, I'll jump through then. Great, we've talked about a little bit about our own perceptions of knowledge and wisdom. We've talked about the intersectionality with technology and what's good with that. So based on your perspectives and your experience, what are some of the biggest opportunities that we have for leveraging these approaches, leveraging these technologies to improve our understanding of the changing ocean? Do we want to start with Samantha or Larry?
Sure, I'll jump in again, and I think again I'm going to come back to the same thing, same theme, that I think the biggest opportunity is really to recognize right up front that there's so much to be learned by including Indigenous knowledge. And that we can truly form partnerships with the Indigenous communities. And from my experience, which is mostly in the Arctic, this has really worked out wonderfully. I mean, we've the key, again, I'll come back to the statement I made before, that the key is that in planning the science, we can't come with a preconceived notion about what we're going to do. We can't come with a plan. We have to come with ears and eyes open and listen to the needs of the community, and listen to their understanding of what's going on. And with respect to what we've learned from our involvement with the indigenous communities in the Arctic, that has been tremendously helpful. And so I think that there is opportunity there, but it starts with this change in attitude of saying, we're not going to come in with a plan and say, this is what we're going to do. This is what the science needs. Let's start listening to the needs of the community, to the history of the community, to what they understand about their environment, and let the science evolve from that.
I'd echo onto that. So many people are always blown away at the possibility of collaboration and the ease that it happens with, and the opportunity that arises out of it, and then the information that comes out of that. And it's not a new thing, but apparently people don't seek that out or even consider that as an option when doing research or projects or seeking information. And tribal indigenous communities are very open to that. It just is a process to work with, finding one that has the time and the opportunity to align. And those are just wonderful possibilities that are available on an ongoing basis. So I really encourage people to think in that manner, not just the traditional route and steps that have been taken, but really think about, can we wrap in somebody to our, nonprofit or this project, or, collaborate on a research project. I'm always looking for people that want to collaborate. And I'm always
What is the purpose of the work if we're not going to do it all the way right?
Indeed, and I'll just amplify and say it's not just about paying the intern to participate. It's also about being mindful of the participation needs of others for their home life.
Mm-hmm.
That could be childcare, that could be elder care issues. Like, we have to be mindful of this as we're doing field science, and we're actually encouraging people to participate in field science. So thank you. I think we've lost our 2 online participants. Can somebody confirm that? Because I can't see them anymore. All right, so we've lost them. So I'm going to skip the next question, which would have been primarily likely for Larry. But we've talked about some of the opportunities. We've talked clearly about some of the challenges that have come forward. One of the things that I think about when I think about working with communities and integrating these approaches is the need to consider and respect the co-interpretation of data. The need to think about data sharing and data provenance. Are there challenges or risks to openly sharing sharing all the data and all the knowledge involved in the work? Things that we think about differently as we look at the data aspect of this?
Start. So I spent 10 years working with American Indian tribes, both in the Midwest and the Northwest, around geospatial data and indigenous data sovereignty. And every tribe that I worked with was deeply concerned about who had access, control, use, interpretation of their data about their lands, their communities, and their resources. They're concerned by the sophisticated nature of geospatial data and high-resolution satellite remote sensing and what it can reveal. They've had actual experiences of reduced power at the bargaining table with timber companies and mining companies because their data has been shared through the Freedom of Information Act with parties with whom they were in negotiation. Water litigation, water rights litigation, their data has been shared inappropriately with third parties. So they have real-world experiences of exploitation and impact and their own safety. So I think there needs to be change. There needs to be a tribal exemption to the Freedom of Information Act. As federal researchers getting federal grants, we need to be aware that if we collect this information, it can be accessed by parties that don't have the tribe's best interest at heart. So we need to be very careful about where our funding comes from, what contracts we sign around the data, because that can have implications. There is now a global network focused on Indigenous data governance and Indigenous data sovereignty. There's a national network led by Professor Stephanie Carroll at Arizona State University. And there's an IEEE working group looking at Indigenous data provenance to make sure that the authorship, the attribution is attached to the data in perpetuity, that the data is used appropriately, and that when appropriate, there might be shared benefits.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, when I think about data sharing, immediately I think about open access papers and what that looks like. There is definitely a huge cost associated, and I don't know how we haven't uprised against the publishers yet, but I think that's something that is important as we're thinking about our research and including that in grants. Like, hey, you put in money for publications and you put in the low budget. Go ahead and put in the high budget so you can make sure it's open access. You know, someone sent me a paper, it was about like diversity and inclusion in science, say. And then I click on the link and it said, you need to pay $19.95 to read this. I was like, well, diversity and inclusion, and like it's about access. So I think that's something that we can just think about. I think with sharing data in general, I would love to say that we can be more, we should be as open as possible. We should be having, open data networks, but it is also, especially when in communities as scientists of color, we have folks that will try to take credit for our work and and you have to be honest about that as well. There's a power that happens, and there's also just shady stuff that occurs. So I know why there is the reason why there is like that lack of data sharing, but I think, again, if we talk about that more and we acknowledge that these things are happening, then maybe we can have some protection, especially for early career scientists.
I want to look at that from another angle too, and I agree with you about the open source. And Schmidt-Ocean Institute now pays for all of our scientists to make their papers that come on board about the research open source so that it can be seen. But the problem is when we say the data is publicly available and it's open for the communities we work in, putting unprocessed data into a public repository where people aren't trained to pull the data or extract the data or apply it to the community's work that they need the information for, that's not quite open. And so I think from the other side of it, we also need to look at how we make data more usable when we are collecting data in the groups that we're working with.
Can I build on that?
Yeah, please.
I love those comments. I think often as researchers, we throw the data over the transom and hope that it gets used, right? But building capacity within communities to use the data themselves, to collect the data on their own terms is absolutely essential. So, for example, when we worked with one of the tribes in the Midwest, we taught geospatial classes for 3 years at all levels, at the high school level, at the undergrad level, at the tribal college, and with the tribal government staff, so that it stayed within the community, that knowledge, and then helped them get the software licenses, the computing, et cetera, again, so that they had the capacity there to use the data after we left. Right?
And going back to your earlier point about communications is what kind of products can we put out there for different audiences where we can report the information that we're collecting. A scientific paper is wonderful for a particular audience, but how else can we translate the information that we're gleaning for other groups?
When we talk about authorship, as academics, right, we hoard the information for the year until we publish it. But community members want to see that data and the results now. They want to see how their contribution was part of that greater impact. And so how can we make those results available sooner? How can we make sure that community members are included as co-authors on this paper or a lead author on the papers, right?
This is the best panel ever. They just keep going back and forth. Fantastic, right? We've got some questions from the audience, some of which have already been touched upon, about language, which is great, about access, which is great. One of the questions I think really follows on this very particular conversation we're having right now, which is, as we think about community science or citizen science beyond just data collection, how do we move it into a space where the data is actually used by decision makers or for conservation policy?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that we have to first do what we've been talking about. We have to collect the data, get the community trained, get the community involved so that we are getting, good quality data that is going to be used for scientific papers. And then we do write that paper. We do our job to get the data out there in the form of a white paper, but also other forms of science communication as well. So I think that's really about us making sure that the methods that we do have developed when we are putting together our community science program, that we are thinking about that. So the program that I was involved with at UCLA was called CHOW DNA. And so we actually set up like a whole full YouTube training where folks could do on their free time and go and get trained to be able to collect eDNA. And then we would have what we call bio blitzes, where we would have the whole community come together. We would have senior scientists there, and then we would do a whole huge collection. But if folks couldn't attend, we would actually mail them kits so they could collect on their own after they had did the YouTube training. So this was a really easy way to get folks involved. It did take some planning, of course, on our part to get all of that together. But once we did, it was just a really good method to continuously involve the community. And then after we were done, we did write a huge paper. I think it's on my CV, probably has about 40 folks on there. But this was again to say, hey, this was a huge effort. This was a community science effort, and this is how we saw it. So, yeah.
I just want to quickly add to that. Just like co-design should not be an afterthought, communications should not be an afterthought. And clearly I'm preaching to the choir on this, but having professionals that can translate the science that's taking place for specific policymakers or marine park managers so that they can understand the impact of the science that's taking place and make decisions from there.
I completely agree. I'm part of the choir, and I'm married to an individual who does that for a living. Right? So I'm glad to see that we have Larry and Samantha back. I'm going to direct a couple of questions directly at them, if I could. And Larry, first for you. Given your role as chair of the U.S. Committee for the UN Decade of Ocean Science, what do you see is the role of the multinational efforts like the UN Decade in advancing the complementarity of traditional knowledge in Western science?
Yeah, Alan, thanks. I think this is really our chance to really make progress in this space. And this is because the Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, that big name, I'll just call it the decade from now on, which is a UN initiative, really represents at a global level recognition at the highest levels of government of the critical role that the oceans play in sustaining our lives, our livelihoods, and our well-being. And with respect to our panel's discussion, one of the things that really sets the decade apart is that it not only addresses key science questions like ocean pollution, climate change, and so on, but it also recognizes the role that the ocean plays in humanity and addresses how science will be done, which includes things like co-development, partnerships with Indigenous peoples, and the availability and access of data to all. So I think we have now this opportunity really at a global level to see this recognition. And from a U.S. perspective, the U.S. National Committee was charged with developing a set of innovative cross-cutting themes worthy of future investment that aligned with these UN Decade goals and also with U.S. science priorities. And we just published a report on that. And I think I have one slide that gives a link to that report, which may be useful. And I don't know if that will come up or can come up. Maybe it'll be up, but we'll see. There it is, yeah. And so what we recommended were 6 cross-cutting themes, 4 of which, the ones on the bottom in green, we call topical themes, and they represent fundamental aspects of and approaches to ocean sustainability, and offer really a framework under which kind of bold new interdisciplinary research programs can further be defined and developed. And these are, that you see on the bottom there, things like the Ocean Revealed, which is about observations, the Restored and Sustainable Ocean, about ecosystems, ocean solutions for climate resilience, and Healthy Urban Seas, which is really a place-based effort looking at the amplified problems when we have high population density in proximity to the ocean. But again, with respect to the topic today, we also had these two blue themes, these what we call foundational themes that really address the underlying infrastructure of how we're going to conduct science, the science that's described in those topical themes. And from these two foundational themes, the inclusive and equitable ocean and an ocean of data, what we hope to develop are approaches and best practices that will ensure the inclusion and recognition of things like indigenous knowledge, and that informational resources are accessible and meet the needs of diverse communities through engagement in the development of research priorities and through co-production of knowledge. And really the idea is that the protocols and best practices derived from these fundamental themes will be applied to each of the four topical themes. And so I think what we're seeing now, Alan, is really both a national and global effort that recognizes these issues, and we're having frameworks established that really are going to try to address them.
Great. Thanks, Larry. Really appreciate that. And the perspective and what you're doing on the U.S. committee. I want to reserve some time for a last question, but I want this question to go directly to Samantha, because I know you and I have talked about this in our sessions before today, but one of our audience members has basically made the point, a good one, is that community-based science and traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge do not just augment Western science, but are science. Do you have thoughts on that? Samantha, I don't know if you heard us. I don't know if you can hear us. We're having some internet issues here in the building, so I don't know if they're hearing us at this point in time. Unfortunately, I guess we're not going to get her answer to that question.
So I would agree. I would agree. These are scientific methodologies, absolutely.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how I started with my comments today. I think there's co-op, like there's science, and we're trying to, act like it wasn't when we use these methods to create this Western science.
Right.
Indeed. And I'll chime in from afar and say that, whether they're scientific methodologies or not, they're pragmatic approaches.
Yes. Indigenous science has been around
results
for a very long time, and that's one of the things that sets apart community science from. Did we freeze again? Yes.
This is so funny.
Oh.
She was about to say something good too.
Yeah.
I could feel it. She was about to. Dang.
Well, it seems like we've frozen again. We've got just a little over 5 minutes left. And so I really want to take a moment to have everybody have an opportunity to comment on the final question, right? Which is, it succinctly, hopefully, are there recommendations that you might have for federal agencies or for Congress to support these emerging approaches towards improving our understanding of the ocean?
Yes. So many. Where to start? First, I think National Science Foundation and funding agencies need to provide support for co-design early on, not just for funding science, but funding for engagement in communities beforehand, and making sure that there's support for paid scientists, that lead scientist parties also include scientists from the areas that they're working in, and that there is financial support for those roles.
Okay, let me see. So I think there is definitely a lot. I think we should be talking more about just educating youth earlier. So are we putting a marine science curriculum in K through 12 education? I also think a lot when, I introduce myself as a marine scientist, people make comments like, oh, you can swim? I'm like, whoa. But the truth is that Black children are 2 times more likely to drown. And that is something that we know widely, but there is no policies, no efforts being put to say, hey, let's get free swim lessons. Because if we know that this is a barrier for them to be marine scientists and they're not even making it because the people are drowning by swimming, what are we actually doing? How are we ever going to diversify the field? And then, of course, putting money for science communication at the beginning is not small budget. There is a lot to create videos. Definitely y'all look at on the Black Marine Science YouTube channel. We have over 100 episodes of different Black marine scientists across the world talking about marine science topics, talking about the ocean. And so again, that is content that we're creating, but it's not seen as, oh, this huge thing, give me $1 million NSF grant. But you could.
So my colleagues at NOAA absolutely want to do community-based science efforts. But in order to do this, they need to get approval for something called the Paperwork Reduction Act. That approval process is incredibly bureaucratically burdensome and can take more than a year sometimes to get that approval. It often, if you've got a small project with limited budget, staff time, will kill the project, right? And this Paperwork Reduction Act was written at a time when it was considered a burden for the American public to contribute information to the government. With community-based projects and larger scale crowdsourcing projects, folks want to contribute. They're excited about it. This is fun. They feel like they're having an impact on real science. And so the times have changed. In addition, we now have crowdsourcing platforms that allow the federal government to gather data from the American public, millions of people. Some of these projects can have 2 million people contributing. So we need to update the 2010 OMB memo for scientific research. We need to update the Paperwork Reduction Act to allow for these kinds of approaches. And we need to allow for a blanket paperwork reduction approval for NOAA citizen science projects.
And all other citizens.
And all other citizen or community-based science projects, yeah.
Indeed. Larry, thoughts?
Yeah, I think from the highest level, we all need to get behind Congresswoman Bonamici and the Blue Globe Act and the legislation we're seeing like that, which is going to be remarkably helpful. At a finer level, I'll come back to the recent report of the U.S. National Committee, which has a series of really, I think, tangible recommendations for a way forward that include this important foundational theme of an inclusive and equitable ocean and an ocean of data. And there will be follow-up workshops. There's one being scheduled already, particularly on the inclusive and equitable ocean. I ask that folks pay attention to that and participate in that. And the recommendations that will come out of that workshop for the real meat of the effort, I would hope that we would see legislation that would fund that and support that.
Fantastic. Thank you. We are coming at the end of our time. I want to thank the panelists, apologize for the technical difficulties, and especially for Samantha's case, who hopefully we'll circle back with. Wonderful thoughts, wonderful conversation. I think if I might want to put something on the end of it that just changed. But we've got 30 minutes left. Oh. That told me 1 minute and 22 seconds. Now it says 15 minutes. Okay.
It's only 10.
Let's go to some Q&A.
I was wondering about the time warp here in Ottawa.
I was just reading the clock. So, pardon me. This is like the weirdest David Letterman moment ever. All right. So we've already addressed this one. All right. So when engaging local and Indigenous communities, how do we overcome some of these issues of access that have been raised here today? Are there ways, tangible, practical things that you think can and need to be done to overcome the issues of access?
Well, I think it's foundational. So we have to start to make sure that we have broader diversity in the sciences. And that starts, as was discussed early on, how do we do better with ocean science and engaging scholars in ocean science and bringing them up within the communities? It's the first starting point, at least.
Yeah, I think the access to resources, for the communities. Like when you're thinking about, putting these workshops together and putting these committees together, it's like, well, what are going to be the needs for someone to be able to come? Maybe you think about, what do you need? Like, you need a car to get to the meeting if you're going to drive, or you need internet if it's on Zoom. You need someone to watch your kids during this meeting time. And so again, like that other person that you're inviting to this meeting is going to need that as well. And it's not saying that everybody who is Black or brown is down and out and needs all this help, but it's about you thinking about these folks and providing this support, because you are asking a service of these people to be able to help you reach the goals that you would like to see, to be able to help these communities. So to be able to, I guess, get the insight from these communities. Because a lot of the times, we go to these communities and they didn't ask us to come. It was like, we were just chilling. We were figuring it out. We have our stuff going on. But then we come in, plop in, ready to save folks that weren't necessarily looking for it. And maybe there is, of course we do sometimes need to help because some folks might not know that there is a need. But I think how we approach and insert ourselves into these communities is very important. And especially when you have, a group of, I'll just be honest, white scientists coming into some of these communities, it's like, hey, that's not really the best. When white folks come into our communities with clipboards, that usually leads to like redlining, different things like that. We don't never know, gentrification. So we need to be upfront about the historical trauma that is in these communities and say, hey, I need to address this. Folks that look like me did bad things. And now there's a lack of trust. So how can I change that? How can I think about this in a way that I'm trying to help? I'm a good person, I'm trying to do something well. But that was not always the case. So how can we put that in the forefront of our mind and think about, maybe I shouldn't be the one rolling up with a clipboard like that. How can I figure this out?
Others? Samantha, you're back. I'm going to go back to the question that I was trying to ask you, and hopefully you can respond now about this comment that was made by one of the audience members about traditional ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge being science and not just augmentation of science.
I do want to tack on just briefly with the going into communities. That's really important, and especially Indigenous communities. If a tribe is sovereign, what does that sovereignty mean? So many people don't understand sovereignty, and the fact that tribes that are sovereign have intellectual property rights, and that going in doesn't mean that they can access all of that data. So tribes do have rights to their intellectual property. So that's a really key component. And then rolling up with the clipboards, absolutely. We've had so much theft in Indigenous communities that it is very threatening to have somebody approach you. So that's a really big component, and accessing the people that are available and are Indigenous sciences, in the Indigenous science community. And there are really qualified people, so seek those out, not just the people who want to speak for us and think they can. Really look at who's out there, and you have absolutely phenomenal opportunities to access some of the people out there in science. So Indigenous science has been around for since time immemorial, and we heard with some of the beautiful examples that were given about the Hawaii long-standing traditional knowledge, and like navigating by stars and knowing the ocean currents. Here in the Pacific Northwest, tribes up and down the coast in the Pacific Northwest knew how to navigate the ocean, and it was our highway, it was our superhighway. We went up and down along the coastline, and that was a really advanced form of ocean science that many people still today are grappling with. When is the tide coming in? I have to buy a tide book, instead of really understanding the ecological process in that environment. So a lot of times these Indigenous sciences are very, very finely tuned and honed over thousands of years. And that's really misunderstood, because Western science is very short in its timeline in comparison. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, that happens because Indigenous science is measured by Western science methodologies and standards, and that's impossible. A holistic view that is much, much longer in time and vetted in a different way by the community, by these experts that are our elders and such, is not done in the same way that Western science is done. And so it is very difficult, and it's very easy for people to brush it off and say, well, that's not science because it's not done in the Western science manner. And that's just inaccurate. You can't judge apples and oranges. They're fantastic when you put them together, but they are separate entities.
Great, thank you, Samantha. And I know, Tira, you had commented on this, but do you want to add anything? Does anybody else want to comment as well? If not, okay. Larry, go ahead.
I'll just add a quick one, Ellen, and that's that in coming to communities, we come with our science questions and we want to engage the community, but I think we also need to very, very carefully listen to what the problems of the community are. And I think that we'll often see that our long-term science goals are not at all out of sync with what the problems of the community are, but they're not expressed in the same way. And I think it's very important as we do that engagement that we make sure that the results of our efforts, our collective efforts, really address the local problem too, and are expressed in such a way in terms of the products we produce, the output that we produce, in a way that it is of immediately recognizable to the local community that this is helping them too.
Yeah.
Immediately.
On that note, I just have an example. So I'm working on a project now where we're trying to increase science communication in frontline communities about nutrient pollution. So we set up these interviews. We're going to these communities and we want to talk to all these folks just to educate them, let them know about nutrient pollution. This is what I'm coming to do as a scientist. And so as we're doing these interviews, though, they're educating me about nutrient pollution, telling me how they've created community gardens, how they're doing things. And they're actually like, we have been trying to get policymakers to listen to us, but they just don't. They don't respond to us. They don't care about us in this community. And I was like, oh. So it really changed my perspective as the scientist coming in, thinking there was this disconnect with the community or a lack of education, when really, no, they saw this problem, saw that no one was coming to help them or to provide them any support, and really started taking on the issue together as a community and was really wanting us to say, I don't need your education. I need you to get me more resources so we can continue our efforts. And also, if you could talk to your friends on the Hill, that would be great. And I was like, oh, this is completely different. So I think when you really do start getting into the communities and ask questions and really listen, you'll find that these communities are definitely advanced, but again, they have been either left out of the conversation or left out of the legislation.
Well said. And I think it actually jumps into one of the other questions from the audience. And Larry, you just touched upon this a little bit about listening and learning and making sure that you're understanding. Same thing here. You touched upon this as well, Carly. One of our members of our audience is really excited to hear this talk about language being an important part of the conversation. The question that they have is that they feel like science research language continues to be further and further from everyday language. And if you agree, they'd like to kind of know, how do we expect to involve community or youth if there's a massive language barrier? Are there best first steps to fix these barriers?
Yeah, I would say use as much as possible plain language, not the scientific jargon when you're working with communities or with policymakers. I often tell the scientists in my institute, explain your research to me as if you were talking to your grandfather or your grandmother, right? So that would be the first step.
Yeah, I mean,
and if
go ahead.
If I could chime in and say that it's not just the language of science, it can be language full stop. And I just heard a wonderful talk yesterday here in Ottawa about mapping, so offshore mapping, hydrographic project involving the local community, but it got nowhere until they started to produce charts that were in Inupiat. And all of a sudden, it just resonated with the local community, and it really gained engagement. And so it's language, everyday language, but it's also necessary sometimes to have a different language per se in terms of the output.
Yeah, I would agree. I was going to make that point, Larry. I was able to attend the UN Decade Priority Setting meeting in Africa, in Cairo, Egypt. And that was a large conversation. There was like, oh, there's not a lot of ocean science publications from Africa in general. And then there was a large point of there is disconnect of the language barrier. A lot of those folks don't do their research or write their papers in English. And so they're not being accepted into our journals. So if we know that's a barrier, how can we put our efforts together and say, hey, you can write the paper in your native language, but now we have a group or an organization that is translating that to English to make sure it's accepted and accessible to our publications. So I think there's things that we can definitely do and discuss, but we just have to do it. And again, all of that is going to take what? My favorite thing? Money. Okay? Money. Because we're going to have to pay folks. But again, you shouldn't have to, I have to now learn English to be a scientist. No, I should be able to do my English in whatever language, because again, that language is important where I'm at. And so I need to be able to use that same language to communicate my science to the folks in my country. But if I have to now constantly worry about translating, then they're not going to submit papers. And so we are losing all of that vibrant research that's happening there in Africa. And we've never even seen it because of that barrier that we're not really talking about.
The problem is when you translate, you lose a lot of the meaning sometimes as well. And so being able to have scientific publications or reports in the language that you're doing your research in is critical. And not only that, in the naming of places is another big issue in science. And when you're looking at new species or new features underwater per se, making sure that like, I'm just going to come in and name this thing, that you're not taking that onus, and that you're working with the community to make sure that the naming is appropriate and in the appropriate language, and that you're using place names in your research to really get the context and the meaning for the areas that you're working in.
Okay. So another question from the audience says that collaboration begins with the hypothesis. The goal of the project begins with the people. The question is, do we make time to take that step, to engage the people early on in the development of a hypothesis, particularly in this context of working with communities, working with traditional knowledge and wisdom? Are there things that we can do to improve?
Yeah, so to all the people who send me proposals 2 days before it is due for your broadening participation, y'all could do better. So I think that we know how grants are set up. We know the requirements of these grants. And so folks do have a lot of great ideas, and sometimes, there's time and you have to hurry up and get things done. But whenever you feel like getting your fingers ready to send an organization that you've never worked with before a proposal 2 days before it's due, stop talking about broadening participation. It's gonna put a bad taste in their mouth. I just hope y'all can imagine that. And I really feel like you can't, because I receive them so frequently, so it must just feel like it's something that people should do. But please stop. No, I don't wanna be involved in this proposal because it's clear you were like, I wrote this proposal, oh no, Black people, oh no. And we have to stop with that. If we're thinking about inclusion, if we're thinking about accessibility, if we're thinking about community engagement, that should be the forefront of the proposal. How did you put a whole proposal together and not even reach out or think about these folks to be included? So that practice has to be stopped. It's disappointing, it's insulting, and I write that no. So just don't do it. Just don't. But there are ways to do this. Like, soon as the RFP comes out, soon as the proposal comes out, as soon as you start to think about it, just propose it to folks like, hey, would you be interested in developing a proposal with us? Here is the RFP. You may not have seen it. Here it is. Does this tickle your fancy? Would you like to be involved? Versus, here's everything that I want to do, and I want to tag your name on it because. It's like, you don't even know what do I want to be involved? Am I going to be good with this? So I think it's really, again, thinking about that at the very beginning, and then putting the effort and the time in to engage those folks and get them excited about working with you, because then you have now another proposal writer, someone who's going to be down for you all the way through the proposal and the research.
And it'll include that depth. Yes. That they don't get, frequently I will see that it gets through a review process, or an editor says, where's your diverse voice on this, or who's your diverse person, Indigenous person or something. And it's like a week before it's due, or 2 weeks before it's due. And I'm like, wait, what? And look at what you need when it comes out. And there are lots of people to collaborate with, and it makes your proposal so much better if you walk together in that process. It really shows.
Maybe we're evolving a tangible recommendation for some place like NSF that within the proposal construction process, there actually be a pre-proposal travel fund or communication fund that allows the community to make those contacts first, because Tiara is absolutely right. I mean, it's too late at the end. The hypothesis should be derived in consultation. And so, and I speak from a long history as a soft money researcher. You know, if there was a fund that would allow us to make those visits to develop the hypothesis, it may really help promote this sort of co-development of knowledge.
I think it's an excellent point, and I'm going to get to you, Leah, in just one second. I'm going to push on this a little bit. Maybe Leah, you will touch upon this, but quite frankly, in my opinion, I think if we wait to reach out to somebody until the RFP is issued, it's already creating a transactional relationship. The conversation and the collaboration should start before the topic call comes out. That's when the partnership, because that's when you can start to truly build hypothesis together. And then when the calls come out, you just have to figure out which is the right call. So, sorry, I had to interject. Leah.
So I say there's a disconnect in academia between an academic timeline and the need to get grad students through the process and a community timeline and the community's needs. So as a grad student, the university I was at was an old land grant institution, and the tribal college was a new land grant institution. And the folks got together, and the tribe indicated the kind of issues that they wanted help with. And so I was pegged to come in, and we spent a year just to start getting to know people, understanding the context, helping them with geospatial projects that they wanted done, training, doing training classes, et cetera. And over that course of the year and many, many conversations with 6 or 7 tribal government departments and community members and folks in the tribal college, did we develop the research questions together. And so it wasn't in consultation, it was in collaboration, and it was driven by their needs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Leah. Another great question. We've got 7 minutes to go, officially. So this question is that Indigenous communities live with and understand the terrestrial and marine resources in different ways, and they've done so for years. Why did it take so long for the scientific community to recognize this Indigenous knowledge?
I'll throw out a word. Hubris.
You said hubris.
Come on, don't be shy.
I'm not going first. Y'all go.
Okay, Lee.
So with community science, I hear this every single time. What about data quality? Right? And NOAA has a very high standard for data quality and credibility. Citizen science projects, as the research is showing, when designed, or community-based science projects, when designed well, can meet and exceed traditional scientific processes. An example would be the South Atlantic Fishery Council, Management Council's groundbreaking community-based science effort, where they were engaging fishers in the data collection for catch, stock abundance, and biology. The fishers have decades of experience, you know, the complexity, the interconnectivity. They know the data that they're collecting very well, and they were able to increase the frequency and the distribution of the data collection so that the quality of the data that resulted was far superior than without their contributions.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes to go. Oh. So, Tara, did you want to go? Please.
Oh, no. Oh, well.
I know.
Oh, my comment was, because I would say it didn't have to. You know, I think there is a lot of things that we talk about now, especially with my organization, Black and Marine Science. There was no way just a couple years ago I could be so bold and so bad to call white people out the way that I do. But it's because of this is so important. And we see that there is such a lack of diversity, a lack of just depth in the science that we're doing in the field. And so when you have folks that are calling this out and sharing their lived experiences, you have to well, I don't say you have to because some folks don't, but you start to say like, oh, wow, I need to see what's happening. I need to try to have an understanding. And I think Indigenous knowledge like Indigenous science, like she said, has always been around, and it was co-opted, as I mentioned before, but there wasn't necessarily that push to include it. And so now we have such Indigenous leaders and advocates who are saying, hey, please stop stealing our stuff. Like, come on. And when you have someone that loud in that message, you really start to have to listen to it. So I really think like the increase in the communication advocacy work that we're seeing and environmental justice work that we're seeing paired with science has really changed the tide of how we're doing things. And we're having folks who are really start listening. You know, I've been talking about things for a while, but it wasn't until I really started saying what's happening and being very bold and upfront that people really started listening. And I started to see a change in the tide.
Thank you.
And I think people are more open. I started seeing a change when climate change impacts were being first recognized. And that's how I got back into my research. There is a standard bias of, you know, this is the way Western science is done, and this is what we expect to hear. And I think that that's shifting, but I think that's part of that. You know, there's a barrier of, you know, people being trained in a Western science methodology and expecting those patterns to continue. And indigenous science breaks that pattern and is a very different entity. And it pairs and dovetails really nicely, but you have to really give some time for people to get out of that mindset of expecting X, Y, Z and categories and taxonomies and all of those Western science, you know, paradigms. So it is a difficult issue to get them to move into more holistic, comprehensive science.
Fantastic. This has been an amazing panel, notwithstanding the moderator's inability to keep time. But I am going to do the best, and we're going to get out of here on time, particularly since at least one of the panelists has a flight to catch. I want to thank the panelists for all of the comments. I hope to have many more conversations with all of you. I hope you have conversations with the audience. I hope the audience engages with the panelists and each other on this topic. The last thing we need, in my opinion, is this to be the next time we talk about this and have this conversation, to be the next year on this stage. This needs to be a conversation that's happening every day. So thank you for keeping it going.
Thank you guys so much. What a tremendous panel. Just before we go to break, I want to let everybody know about some amazing news. It is World Oceans Day, and I forgot to acknowledge that this morning. So happy World Oceans Day to everyone. But during the course of this panel, yes? During the course of this panel, the administration released some initiatives that they're taking to celebrate World Oceans Day, and I thought I might just take a moment to let folks know what the announcements were. First, they announced that they were initiating designation for a new national marine sanctuary to conserve a Hudson Canyon in the Atlantic Ocean right off of New York, which is wonderful. The Department of Interior will announce and eventually phase out the sale of single-use plastic products in national parks, wildlife refuges, and on other public lands, which is great. The federal government and tribes in the Bering Sea are beginning nation-to-nation coordination on the stewardship of the Northern Bering Sea Climate Resiliency Area. There's a lot here, which is really good news. The administration will develop and implement the first ever whole of government ocean climate action plan. OSTP is going to launch an initiative that will help center environmental justice in federal ocean science and technology activities and investments. I know something that was being talked about. And the U.S. will further strengthen its ocean leadership through International Clean Seas campaign. And then lastly, they're moving Alagum Canoe into the inventory list for nomination as a national marine sanctuary. So this would be the first sanctuary ever in Alaska. So join me, please, in congratulating the administration on these tremendous actions this day. Great. Well, I will look forward to seeing you back in half an hour for our next panel. Have a good afternoon. Well, have a good morning. Sorry.